I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice.
Welcome, peacemakers. Thank you for joining us on this conversation. Thank you for bringing your energy into the conversation on Dr. Martin Luther King's Breaking the Silence speech. I am Myrna Pagan. I'm coming to you live from Vieques, Puerto Rico, an island in the Caribbean, an island of the colony. I am a member of the National Council of Elders, and this evening I am co-host with Mr. Frank Joyce, another member of the Council of Elders. Good evening, Frank. Good evening, all of you. Shalom, peace, aloha. This is our second conversation honoring Dr. King's call to break the silence, when keeping silence is a betrayal of our commitment to work for a culture of peace based on equality and justice. To break the silence against militarism, materialism, racism. This historic day also happens to be the day of the founding of NATO in 1949, as the war in Ukraine and Russia rages on. And in 2023, it will be remembered as the day of the arraignment of Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, first time in history a president or ex-president is accused of crimes. Well, our God works in strange ways. And today, as I was looking through historic happenings on this day, this is what I found. Today is also the day of, oh Lord, can't believe it, World Rat Day. It is also the day of national sexual awareness, sexual assault awareness today, which is also the day to tell a lie. Today is a day you can lie. All of this in honor of Trump, I don't know. I know who we are honoring. I know who inspires us. I know who we love. And it's Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And I leave you now with co-host, Mr. Frank Joyce.
Thank you, Myrna. What an honor it is to share this process with you. I'm Frank Joyce. I'm in El Paso de Robles, California, land of the Chumash people. When we started planning for this year, we said from the beginning that we wanted to understand Dr. King's speech as a living document, as a way to build community discussion and build movement. So in that spirit, as you listen this evening, as we see you are already doing, we encourage you to use the chat and use the Q&A during the webinar. We have live monitors standing by to respond. And anything that we can't address tonight, we will be taking up on the King and Breaking Silence website in the days and weeks ahead. Building movement is not a one-night activity. And that's why we are already planning a program for this coming June 14th, we'll have more to say about that at the end of the program. And Bill, I think it's time to roll the tape.
I am Kathy Wempovi Sanchez from San Ildefonso Pueblo, Ocoque Uinge, from the northern parts of New Mexico. And as we gather here today, I am very glad and excited. And so my voice and your voices should be getting louder and louder and thunderously joyful. We want to make sure that we are going to receive and be ready to receive the blessings of our water relatives. The water is in the cosmos. It's in our bodies. We're vessels that carry water. So as we get ready to receive our water blessings, if you would go grab your water, and if you can't find water near, you are a water vessel. So hold yourself tightly and rejoice in the fact that the water creates the vibrational energy that it takes to break the shackles, to break the bondage that have been placed on us by silencing us, being very fearful. We need to know that we are all relatives. We are not the enemies among ourselves. We are brothers and sisters. So this gathering today is bringing together a lot of different perspectives, but water is essential and our breath is essential. And so with that, I will bless animals that are here, bless the corns, the seeds of our hope. Our Mother Earth is here, the medicine people are here. And so with that, I'll say it in Tewa. Umbia gindi. Nano e hori weke po abaho. Good dog out it don't be. Ah, kitty body toy. And we didn't mind between do it. Erawaho. Ah, kinori you aba. He want the hori ain't nami. He want the hori pungi. You know, trumpet, impet, akompet, something. Oiribo, nugeribo, kiribo, we don't hori mops. What we've asked was for them to guide and protect us, to make us strong in knowing that we are all relatives, all brothers and sisters, and we need the water to be held preciously. So with that, blessings from water. Be in a joyful, happy, loud mood of happiness. We are not afraid. Don't be fearful. We are here together to support each other in our efforts to bring about breaking the silence, making us and our inner voice vibrate with a loving nature that is dear to all of us. So good da. Thank you.
A time comes when silence is betrayal.
There comes a time when silence helps load the gun. A time when silence licks its fingers and snuffs out the candle of justice. A time where silence grows hate, sharp teeth, where silence can become our last word. We must open our hearts, our minds, our mouths.
Hey, we're in the middle of a revolution because I see the face of things to come. Yes, I do.
Which are broader and deeper than nationalism. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, for those it calls enemy.
Every time a basic human right is denied in this country or from this country, we create a hell for ourselves, a dystopia where we are all the main characters, an apocalypse that even the zombies would not return for, a terrible television series. If a society is failing, but won't admit that it is failing, it still fails, I assure you. We must create a world worth loving in, a world worth forgiving for, a world worth screaming towards.
And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
My own government wants to give out the silent treatment, wants us all to hush up and remember the good old days, which were really the worst old days. What we must remember is we are not alone in our pain. We must not be alone in our success.
I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours.
For in this world, silence is a weapon, but so is your voice. Choose wisely. Choose with us. Imagine a world where we are all and us. A world where human nature inspires awe, not fear.
We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
We must stop birthing new monsters. We cannot raise racism or classism or homophobia or transphobia or ableism or ageism or anything that must be fed hate to stay alive. We cannot afford with quiet cost, my people. The price is unforgivably steep. It costs us each other every time.
A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
Our spirit is what needs raising, must be nourished, must be taught to walk, to talk back.
These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love.
We are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty, but love is somehow the key which unlocks the door that leads to ultimate reality. Toni Morrison said, "The purpose of freedom is to free someone else."
Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
Welcome. I want to welcome everybody tonight on behalf of the Breaking the Silence Coalition. My name is Shay Howell, and I'm going to be moderating this wonderful conversation. This is the second conversation in a series that the Breaking the Silence Coalition is hosting. Our first was on January 15th in honor of Dr. King's birthday, and we were lucky enough then to have both Medea and Ash participate in a conversation about the fierce urgency of now. And we'll be hosting at least 2 more conversations that people can join in on. But tonight we are gathering in remembrance of the April 4th speech by Dr. King, Beyond Vietnam, Breaking the Silence, because we want to gather tonight to ask, what are the questions that he helped us think about differently about who we want to be and where we want to go as a people? So we're going to look at King's message from the radical revolution of values and ask what we need to do now. And as part of that, we have our panelists. First, we have joining us Medea Benjamin, who many of you may know is the co-founder of Code Pink and Peace in Ukraine Coalition, among many, many other organizations. And as Ash said in our last conversation, she's probably been arrested more times than any of us know, because she's been so involved in standing against U.S. militarism. Most recently, she's been working to encourage for a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And then along with Medea, we have Ashley Woodard Henderson, who is the first Black woman to serve as the co-director of the Highlander Center. She's a strategist for movements throughout the South, and she's an inspiration for the vision for Black Lives Matters. She's also on the advisory committee of the National Bailout Collective. And with Ash, we've got Loretta Ross, a professor at Smith College. She is a public intellectual who advocates for human rights and especially for the rights and dignity of women. Loretta is a founder of the Work in Rape Crisis Centers and for the Integrity of Women's Bodies. And her work on calling in, not calling out culture is part of why she received this year a MacArthur Genius Award. So we're so glad to have her insights with us. Then we have P.G. Watkins, who is a facilitator, trainer, strategist, working at the very center of the new abolition movement. PG believes that it is possible to create a world beyond jails, detention, and surveillance. They are a project manager at the Blackout Collective and are part of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center in Detroit. And then Reverend Alba Onofrio. She is a leader of Soul Force, and I loved Reverend Alba, your description of yourself as a subversive of systems of domination and a combatant against spiritual terrorism, reclaiming the divine and the erotic. You're one of the founders of the Sexual Liberation Collective, and Reverend Alba also has worked for more than a decade in immigration rights. So we have people today who bring many, many different perspectives to how we can think about this political moment and what we are called to do. What I especially want us to think about as a way to begin is to take a look at Dr. King's speech that he gave in 1967 and to really ask what resonates with you. You know, I read it over in preparation for this, and I was struck by the number of connections he makes. And part of those connections that stood out to me this time in a way that they hadn't before was this connection between history and hypocrisy, where he looked at the history of the US military involvement and said, how is it possible that we can say we are bringing peace when what we are doing is destroying a country? How is it possible we can say we're bringing democracy when we are allowing Black men and white men to die together in a battlefield, but not go to school together in Georgia? So his nailing of that hypocrisy that is such a part of this culture was for me a revelation that I had not really thought of before. So I'm wondering, for those of you who took a look at the speech, what you might have thought both about what resonates with you today, maybe differently than in the past, or what insights it might give you for the work ahead of us. And Medea, I'd like to start with you because this speech was about international work, and that's certainly where you have spent most of your time.
I loved reading the speech again, as I do every time I read it, and find so many things that just strike me as so profound and so relevant today. As I go around these days in the halls of Congress and travel around the country trying to push for a call for the most rational thing, which is peace talks, what I find in Dr. King's speech so profound is this call to not think of ourselves in terms of allegiance to a country, but allegiance to humanity, to think of ourselves as world citizens, to place ourselves in the shoes of the enemy so that we can see from different perspectives. And of course, what is reiterated over and over in the speech is that war is not the answer. And these days, when we have so many people in our political sphere of Congress and the White House, whether it's Democrat or Republican, thinking that more and more weapons are a way to bring justice to the situation in Ukraine, rather than doing what Martin Luther King called for, which was restraint and calm reasonableness. I just wish we had him with us today to talk to those members of Congress and the White House. So those are my immediate impressions, and just the level of understanding of the global sense of where we are today when he said, let's get on the right side of the world revolution. I think the world revolution is one that is calling on the major powers, whether it's Russia, China, or the United States, to stop the fighting, the competition, the killing, and to work together to alleviate global poverty, to deal with the climate crisis. And of course, these are the issues, including racism, that Dr. King told us about. So those are my immediate reflections.
Yeah, thank you for that, Medea. It reminds me that when King made this speech, the global powers did not welcome it either, much as they don't welcome some of the message today. Ash, what have you been thinking about in terms of the speech? I know you have spent a lot of time with it too.
Yeah, I mean, it had been honestly a while, probably since the last time we gathered to talk about the speech, since I both read the text of the speech, but also for all of my friends that like to hear a thing, I went and found it on Spotify and got to hear Dr. King giving the speech, and you just get a different flavor of it to hear the speech given. And I'm reminded of a few things. One is some of my critique of the speech, which I'll share because that's tea. Mm-hmm. And then also what I really unite with about the speech. And, one, Medea's brilliant and agree with much of what she said. I'm first reminded that our beloved Vincent Harding, who doesn't get half of enough credit for his influence of this speech. He, in fact, authored it. Feels important to raise in this sacred space that we're building with this coalition, with these brilliant panelists, with you, Shay, as a moderator, and with all of you that are watching. It's important to give credit where credit's due. Dr. King was brilliant, but he never did anything by himself, right? Let's just start there. That Vincent Harding was an incredible human who has influenced so many, not only 20th century revolutionaries, but also contemporaries, millennials and younger that are doing this work right now, and was definitely someone who all of our Highlander fam has been influenced by. So I wanted to shout out Vincent. Thank you. And what stuck with me to your question, Shay, this time around was how similar some of these threads are to the urgency of now. Both like literally the urgency of right now, but also the work that he did around encouraging people to think about the urgency of the time then, right? Dr. King said that tomorrow is today. Like we're out of time, right? And if he felt that way decades ago, can you imagine how he would feel now? That on top of militarism, on top of materialism, I would say capitalism, and on top of white supremacy, he would say racism, right? On top of militarization, that we also have a global economic crisis, right? We have I think he would have gotten to the place of talking about like the racialized patriarchal economic system that is not only killing everybody, it's killing everybody, but it's particularly and disproportionately killing Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, other folks of color, queer, trans folks, intersex folks. It's killing people here in the US and people abroad. And I think towards Medea's point, he would have had a problem with that. And the other thing that I think is important about this speech that people don't often track for because of how middle of the road and whitewashed King's legacy has become is how many times the brother says revolution or revolutionary. He says it a lot. And I don't think that he and Vincent did that accidentally, right? I think they literally were trying to encourage people to move past their liberal ideas that there's somehow a possibility that you can be neutral on a moving train, as Miles Horton would have said, right? I think he was calling a question that ultimately a year later would get him killed, around what it means to have a revolutionary politic and a revolutionary practice, a theory and a practice of doing the work to fundamentally transform the entire social order, right? Around race, around class, around nation. And I think that is a very prevalent question that we need to be asking ourselves today. He calls out sectarianism at a time where the organized left was extremely sectarian, right? You had to be a certain kind of politic to get into the cool kids club. And I think there's a lot that we have to learn today if we're going to actually beat back fascism, beat back authoritarianism, beat back totalitarianism, and all of the systems of oppression that are killing us by building a broad united front, right? We're not going to stop the war in Ukraine. We're not going to stop any war. We're not going to dismantle any system of oppression just with the folks that just agree with us and live and look and love like us. And so I think this speech has convicted me again to do more to build not a false sense of unity. That's not what he's encouraging, but the development of trusted and valued relationships and respect for one another across our differences for the sake of humanity. And I think that is a critical lesson for us today.
Yeah, on that last lesson, a little bit later on, I'd like us to talk about the implications of this for the movement. But I think just to hold this notion of the contradictions of King clearly talking about revolution and moving forward, and at the same time knowing that that's actually the way to build a broad movement. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And I wonder, Reverend Alba, if we could see what your initial impressions are.
Yeah, I'm really taken. As a spiritual strategist at heart, I'm always taken by the use of Christian rhetoric and religious positioning. And I think it's, I love thinking about what a reverend gets to say that gets to be that gets to be lessened just by the title that goes at the beginning of the sentence, right? At the beginning of the word. So I'm thinking a lot about the soul of America. I think it's actually critically important to those of us who call ourselves people of faith to directly address the ideologies of the foundations of white settler colonialism and colonization that founded the country. And I feel that in this speech, it feels like going back to what you were saying, Shay, about hypocrisy, right? Is like how many of us have left the church because we hear one thing and we see a different thing. And I think that applies right along the lines of national citizenship and global citizenship, that when we say we hold certain values and certain morals, and then we behave in ways directly contradicting those ideals, I think we lose a lot of credibility with so many folks who are trying to find their path. And so I really am just kind of sitting with, what does it mean to be a part of a movement that's trying to save the soul of America, that doesn't back away from morality, for positions of righteousness, for positions that claim truth, not as an intention to divide, but rather to shine a kind of beacon that says this is the way that we're going, and this is how you find like-minded folks, rather than you have to sign off on a 15-page document that you agree with every one of our points and you promise to never mess up and to always toe the line. So I'm just kind of sitting with what does it mean as a faith leader to come at a spiritual strategy that is trying to tear down authoritarianism, fascism, and white Christian supremacy as we see it all over the place at play, even when we aren't conscious of it.
And PG, what about what you've been thinking about in terms of reflecting on the speech as a way to begin?
I would say my initial reaction, one of the things that immediately resonated with me, I listened to it and then forgot how slow of a talker he is, and then had to read it. Like, I'm here. And also, let me get these words in front of me. But the thing that really stuck out to me, because I listened multiple times, was this, the illusion of choice. This idea that like we actually need to make a real choice, not a false choice, that actually there is a decision that has to be made by everyone who is of good conscience, that like we need to protest. There is an action that we need to take. We need to decide what that action is going to be, what's right for us, what matches where we are in the world, and do something. And I think about this because a friend of mine and I always talk about how capitalism gives us the illusion of choice, right? Like, it's like, oh, we feel like we can choose any grocery store and we can choose it, like, you know, but then it's actually like all the same company, all the things are owned by the same people. Like, we're actually not choosing something different all the time. And when I think about this call for radical revolution of values, this call to actually really shift how we're understanding violence and our relationship to racism, materialism, militarism, I feel like there's a way that we actually have to make a choice to do something different and not act like we can actually still just be the same and do the same thing and expect that the world around us will change. So I think it shows up. I have so many thoughts about this thing. I feel like it shows up in so many ways. I think it shows up in how we are with ourselves and with our families and in our interpersonal relationships, and how committed are we to shifting how we treat and how we talk to children. How are we able to shift how we treat and talk to the people that we cross on the street, and trusting that through that practice, that intentional practice of maybe it's a protest against violence, maybe it's a protest against individualism and disconnection, and just the ability to be like, okay, I'm actually going to speak to people. I'm going to be as kind as I can be in this moment. I'm going to give when I can give and not be stingy or frugal or so rigid with my boundaries that nobody can get in, that no one has access to me, that I don't have access to anyone, and actually making a different type of choice. I think the other way it shows up, and this, I think Ashley spoke a little bit to this about the relation to the urgency of this particular moment. Like, I was listening to this and I'm like, he could literally be talking about what's happening right now. You know, like he could literally actually be talking about this exact moment, I'm thinking about my work with abolition of policing and of surveillance, and thinking about like all of the ways that folks tell us that this is the right way to advocate for this thing. We need to actually just get community control over this thing. We actually just need a little more transparency about this thing. We actually just need more training or something for this particular system to be better. And the reality is like, no, there's something that inherently needs to shift about the fact that it exists in the first place, the reasons why we believe it needed to exist, the way we've upholded it and been complicit in the violence that it's enacted, and that we actually have a real choice to make. We have a real choice to make, and that we must protest. We must take action. We must do something. And we can't question actually the ways that others are protesting and what they're choosing to do, especially if we're not willing to protest. But even if we are, people are doing exactly what they're meant to be doing, right? Like, I have to trust that the faith leaders are going to be holding it down and doing the work that they need to be doing. I'm not a faith leader. I'm not going to choose what their protest should be. But yeah, I think that was the part for me that stuck out, that in both times I listened to it before this conversation today, just was like, oh, he only said it one time about this choice thing. And I'm like, but that's the thing. It really stuck with me. We have a choice to make, not a false choice, but a real one. And we have to protest.
I want to, Loretta, hear from you in terms of initial reactions to the speech, or if there's anything that you've heard that you want to comment on.
I always listen to and review Dr. King through the lens of my present work against fascism, because that's what I teach about, that's what I study. And I always deeply contextualize one speech in the context of another. I never isolate one from another, because I'm very fascinated by the thinking of Dr. King. And thank you, Ashley, for bringing in Vincent Harding, who I'm particularly fascinated when he emphasizes the importance of transferring knowledge to the up and coming generations, and how we can't hold people accountable if we haven't chosen to teach them what they need to know. And so that's the lens through which I see things. What I am struck by in the speech is its timelessness as I battle new justifications for imperialism and colonialism from people like Bruce Gilley. And there's a whole school of thought that is still dominant within the American political establishment, is that you save people by killing them, which is, of course, so contradictory. And the fact that we're offered this false binary. Well, let's just start with Dr. King saying, or other people saying, America is divided. I don't see a divided America. I see a white America divided. And at battling for its soul, which is the eternal struggle of the difference between whether we're a country dedicated to democracy, as they define it, and human rights, or liberty, or dedicated to genocide so that we can maintain permanent power and domination over the earth. And so these are the forces that I study, and the forces that I think lead to our constant situation. America is never going to war. America is at war, always. And the fact that we don't analyze that, accept that, and understand that until the prophets are withdrawn from a constant state of war, there will be always people pursuing it and then rationalizing and justifying it. I also am obsessed with a vision of Dr. King's, because he not only criticized what is, but he also envisioned what should be. And in his March 31st, 1968 speech, his last Sunday sermon, he called on us to build not only a moral revolution, but a revolution for human rights. because it's not enough just to define what you're against, but you have to have a vision for what you want to see come about. I don't want to sound too sanguine, but I really do believe that the people who are dedicated to permanent war and fascism are actually holding a losing hand, even though they seem incredibly powerful and dominant right now, because I think they mistakenly think that they're fighting us, the human rights movement. But in fact, they're fighting forces far beyond their power to control, because they're fighting the truth. You know, they're fighting evidence. They're fighting history. And most of all, they're fighting time. And with all of those things on our side, my biggest fear is that we will snatch defeat from the jaws of victory with the way we cannibalize each other. And that's why I've dedicated my last decade of work to calling in the calling out culture, because the opponents to human rights do what they do because of who they are. It's not because of what we do. But I am fundamentally convinced that learning how to, like Reverend Lowry used to say, turn to each other instead of on each other is going to be so important. And I grew up in the very sectarian times that have been mentioned before, where everybody was a target of the state, no matter what shade of red or pink you were. But those divisions seem to be so important. And we're still, unfortunately, at that kind of historical lack of self accountability and reckoning, where people think that they have the right way of doing political struggle, and everybody who doesn't agree with them must by definition be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so useless. One of the things I frequently tell people, if you think you're in a woke competition, that only proves how unwoke you actually are. Because we need to build the power to get these people who do the most harm with their power out of power. And the way you do that is build power, not with people who agree with you, but people who agree to be with you. There's a difference when you're building power, as opposed to just trying to prove how right you can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just close by saying, in my heart and in my soul, I'm always honored to reread Dr. King. Of course, Reverend C.T. Vivian was my boss and my mentor for a long, long time, and I mourn his passing as well. But from Reverend Vivian, I really learned about the power of nonviolent struggle. And I believe that calling in techniques now in the 21st century, as we build this movement to fight fascism, is going to be as important to the human rights movement today as learning about the power of nonviolence and love was to the civil rights movement in the 20th century, because it's going to be a statement of how we do the work, which is as important as the work that we do. And so there's a freshness I feel, and a timelessness I feel about Dr. King's words. It's very hard to extract just one speech of his and not understand the arc of his thinking, the influences on his thinking. But he always, for me, always landed at us understanding what we must do for each other. He was willing to call out the powers that be who abuse their power, but in the heart of his message, it was about how we treat each other in that beloved community. And that's where human rights start, close to home. And how we treat each other is going to change, is going to be the vision for the world that we want to create.
Go
I just
ahead.
want to interject one thing that is so unoriginal and consistent, and that is the purveyors of fascism always condemning their opponents as communists. Always. I mean, there is a striking unoriginality about their perception right now. They're calling their anti-communism fourth generation warfare.
Mhm.
I don't know how they periodicize stuff. Michael Lynn, who you should read if you want to have your stomach turn, calls it that. But all of our struggles against human rights are always called communism. This is what they do because of who they are. So it really doesn't matter whether we believe in Marxism, Leninism or not, because we're going to be accused of it because that is their playbook.
Mhm.
And the risk that we have, and what happened particularly during the time of King, was the risk of being red baited. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the NAACP and the SCLC had to embrace that anti-communist rhetoric. The war between Walter White and Du Bois was about communist, fighting the label of communism. But we have to accept, in my mind, that we're going to be labeled that whether we are or not, because that's what they do. And to not let that deter us from building power with the people necessary to get the people who are doing the most harm out of power. But I actually think the fight over communism is an intentional red herring thrown in our pathway. And they've consistently done that for over 100 years.
I think that speaks to one of the things that King does in this speech, which is demand that we look at this political moment and discern what are the forces that most require our attention. And so I wonder, from your various perspectives, are there things that you see that we haven't mentioned that we should be thinking about as a focus for our political energies?
I want to take off a bit on what Loretta said, just that last thread about communism, and put it in the context that you just asked us, Shay, because I think when we look at the narrative that the political powers and the media have put forth around this fight in Ukraine, it's that Russia is a communist country that is out to conquer the world and get us, and that China is a communist country that is also out to get us. And so this fear of communism and a new Cold War is something that has turned people's heads around, and people who you think should be with us in calling for an end to the war in Ukraine are suddenly people who are calling for more and more weapons. And Loretta, you talked about the white America being divided, and I certainly see that, but I see more divisions, and I see the division between those who are supposed to represent us and those who are not being represented. And when I look at what's happening in Congress, $110 billion being allocated to Ukraine, when Martin Luther King talks about the war being the enemy of the poor and the war poisoning our vision, our soul, I see that happening among Democrats and Republicans. And I see so little reasonableness in terms of those who are supposed to represent us. And on the opposite side, I see more and more people seeing through the propaganda, through the one-sided media narrative, that the US is the democracy against this bad world out there, and that our militaristic response is the right response to conflict. So you see now only 48% of the American people saying they want more weapons sent to Ukraine, and yet we see over 90% of Congress voting for that. So I see a big division, and I see when Dr. King talked about the difficulty of speaking out against your government, particularly in time of war, I see that now so clearly. And then perhaps it was harder because there were Americans dying. And when you have Americans dying, you have a lot of people who don't want to hear criticism of US policy. Today, the wars are more hidden from the American people. It robs us of the money we need for college education, for food assistance to people who need it, to housing, all those things. But the American people don't see it. And so I think in some ways it's harder today to go up against that media narrative, the pro-war, the anti-communism, harder for us to build a more broad-based movement. And that's why it's so important to have these kinds of reflections where we look at where are our potential allies and how do we get to them? How do we bring them on board on a peace train?
Social movements all over the world are doing things that are making democracy more possible in a way that forces white supremacists, Christian nationalists, paramilitary forces, and the capitalist class, folks who are hoarding power and wealth at the expense of everybody else, the folks that believe in necro-capitalism, right? That because they have more money, they should get to decide who lives and dies, right? Those folks might be in, frankly, their last gasp if we get this right. If we get this right. And that doesn't mean we have to, like, you know, King goes on in the speech to talk about even the sacrifices that he's had to make to have the courage to break his own silence. He's self-critical in this speech, right? About what it meant that he hadn't said anything about Vietnam yet. Many of us are there, right? We can't talk about everything, or, oh, we're focused on, you know, building Black power, or focused on the environment, or focused on this, that, and the other. I don't have to be an expert in everything. Sure, that's true. But it does, our silence does mean something, and he talks about that. And I think there's something to be said about what it means then, not only to build this sort of beloved community, everybody like in it to win it together sort of sentimentality or solidarity as a praxis sort of politic for the sake of winning. I believe in winning. I want to do that. But it's also very simply that if we don't start to build together outside of our sectarianism, we literally will not have enough power, enough stamina, enough resources, enough brilliance, to PG's point, enough relationship to see where we're blind, where we're like not paying attention or don't have relationship. If we don't build frankly, a united front that is a people of color led, multiracial, democratic united front against fascism, we're in for a world of hurt. And it won't just be that we have a couple of bad years. We are literally, I'm telling you, as someone calling live and in living color from the fascist state of the South, that we literally will spend the next 40 years rebuilding things that folks have fought for centuries. So I'm excited about what it means that folks can take tools like the Breaking the Silent speech and work with folks like the National Council of Elders and the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Code Pink and all the incredible organizations that are represented across these panel for the sake of literally saving democracy. We can fight back and forth. It's a fake fight too, but we can fight back and forth about that all day, about whether or not democracy is the goal here. But humanity, survival is. I think we can at least agree on that. And so I feel excited about what this can do to push us past our sectarianism towards building the biggest, baddest, sexiest, awesomest, like colorful united front that we can, because it won't really matter what sort of identity politics we play if fascism wins.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, Ash, you're bringing us to the sort of the last question I'd like people to really think about, which is, how do we do that? What are the things that are in our way? And by that, I mean not just ideas, but the sort of spiritual energy that's in our way around moving toward a larger united power in this country. And what would you encourage people who watch tonight to do? And maybe not just do, but do differently than what they're doing now. So I'll just put that out there as a question, and whoever wants to respond. But I think it's how do we now move toward community from chaos?
This idea of moving towards community from chaos, to me, is like the chaos. There will always be chaos. There will always be a contradiction. There will always be something. And I feel like one thing we have to get really good at, and that I see some folks practicing at, but that collectively, I think in this united front that needs to be built, what we have to get good at is being able to hold contradictions, to be able to hold multiple truths about a thing, to be able to hold multiple experiences about a thing, and to like actually have practice with, I experienced this thing this way and it made me feel this way, I acted this way because of that. You experienced the exact same thing, but it was different for you. You acted differently. Here's how we both impacted each other. Here's where we are not able to maybe see this in the same way because of who we are in the world, because of social positioning, because of our particular experiences, because of trauma, because of identity, whatever. But like, if we aren't actually able to hold the multiple truths, all of the complexity of what is, I think we're going to keep coming up against this false choice, this door of like, okay, it's either this or that. You're with me or you're not. I think folks were talking about that earlier with some of like the infighting of like, if you're not doing it this particular way, if you don't say that this is exactly what you're going to do, then, you know, you can't sit with us. We're not going to be able to do this thing. We cannot work together. You're not trustworthy, right? All of these things.
Yeah, thanks, PG. Anybody else on what we might need to do now?
Well, I would like to give people a place that they can go to learn more about the war right now, acknowledging, as Dr. King said, that this is just a symptom of a larger problem of militarism. And that is a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. It's peaceinukraine.org. Just to be part of the conversation, all you would have to do is join 1 hour every 2 weeks to hear what people are talking about, what kinds of things they're doing in their communities. And I think also just to recognize that, as we've said here, our government tries to distract us with wars overseas from the problems here at home. Our government tries to convince us that we're the democracy when we have so many issues that we have to deal with at home. Our government tries to convince us that there's no money for all the programs that we need to make our communities better. And every time we're fighting for the crumbs, we should always be saying, why is there $1 trillion to spend on war and not money for our community needs?
Anybody else want to have a last thought to share?
I would love to piggyback a little bit on what PG said. I think I'm very inspired by seeing so many people working on healing. I think that we talked about it as a woo-woo concept for a long time, where it was like self-care and bubble baths and shit that honestly doesn't make a damn bit of difference in our lives for most of us. But I feel like we have shifted, we have tilted toward understanding healing practices as something that's actually central, that we are not machines, in fact, like the capitalist system tries to tell us, that we aren't just machinations, but rather we are beings that have a fullness of spirit as well as our humanity. So I think one of my biggest concerns is the hopelessness that I see happening, because it feels so big. And I think, so one of the things I would say is just reminding us and each other. I love this, and I will say it often from going forward, Miss Loretta, of we will snatch defeat from the jaws of victory if we are not careful. I I have heard that from many of our activists in Latin America, of like, they're fighting so hard because we're winning. And I think in things like words like socialist and communist do not land the same way that they landed however many years ago. I hear more and more young people being like, and what? Like, it just doesn't have the same kind of sting. And I think that that speaks to this orientation that some of us have. I mean, I've been Mexican my whole life. My family isn't from Mexico, but for any of us in the South, at least where I come from, we speak Mexican, we are Mexican. And so rather than being like, no, my family's actually from this, as opposed to doing that, just being like, actually, we are all in this camp of those who are seen as illegals and all of this other stuff, and pulling that together rather than needing to set ourselves above. So I want to just name that some of this healing practices, I love this about the false binaries. I think understanding conceptually things like binaries. White Christian supremacy is what installed the concept of binary, because once we have a binary, we can talk about what is good and by reference point be talking about what is bad. And this either or kind of orientation is the thing that gets installed in us from the time we're children. And we teach people that Black is the opposite of white, and fat is the opposite of thin, and tall is the opposite of short, rather than understanding our world in so many different kinds of cosmologies that are available to us, that kind of opposite thinking or binary thinking sets us up for inevitable divisions and all kinds of problems. So that, and then the last thing I would say is around this understanding of the erotic. I'm thinking about Audre Lorde. I'm thinking about the Imago Dei, this part of us that knows in our bodies and our beings and our souls, from our ancestors, from the cloud of witnesses, from the divine, however you want to call it. And I think that's about practicing agency wherever we can claim it, from the smallest thing to the largest things, that we as a movement, as movements, as human beings have to really work on our own individual, as part of a community, but our own individual muscles of agency.
And Ash, I see you getting ready to come in, and then we'll ask for that final benediction from Dr.
I always want to go before Loretta Ross. If the debate is wait for her to tell me what to do, or just go on and get mine out of the way so she can correct everything I say, I'd rather go first. I think a couple of things. One is, like, in this time where fascists and neoliberals would make us think up is down and down is up and right is left and left is right and neutrality is possible, that being frozen and stuck in uncertainty and confusion and misinformation is the only way that our people can be. Or at a time where, frankly, those of us that have become or have always been professional class in movement spaces make assumptions about what regular ass people can and cannot understand, that it is important, is critically important in this moment where fascism isn't a thing that's coming. It is a nearly foregone conclusion and is absolutely happening right here in the United States. That it's more important than ever to listen to trusted leadership who has a track record of getting us out of this mess, right? And there are plenty of people, we can share resources around folks to listen to, organizations to join, things to read that prepare us. But even if you don't do any of that, be very, very clear that distraction and fake fights are us doing the work of the enemy on their behalf without any need for them to be any more subversive than they already are, right? And in fact, most of this white supremacist, Christian nationalist, militaristic, capitalistic, anti-Black and anti-everybody sentiments aren't particularly secret anymore. They have power, right? So I think there's just part of it is just us being really intentional that we won't get played by treating each other like we're the target versus actually having a target that is fascism or the three evils or fighting to save this planet from ecological disaster any more than we're already going to have to face because of decisions we'd already made, right?
Thank you.
And I feel like I never want to go after Ashley, so I'm so glad we're a mutual admiration society. I have to bring my last remarks back to my childhood. I was a military brat. Dad was an immigrant whose only opportunity for employment was to join the army, and so I was raised on military bases. I understand army military culture. My first job as a volunteer was in a military hospital looking at those people who came back from Vietnam missing huge portions of their bodies when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. And so I've been implacably opposed to war since then. My high school graduating class, we had our first reunion. About a third of the boys had died in Vietnam when we had our reunion, because we just had their pictures on the wall. We didn't have their bodies with us only 10 years later. And so that's the kind of visceral immediacy we have to help build in the American public in order to stop this situation of perpetual war. And by the way, a lot of our children are being fed into the maw of this dragon called war, even though it's not visible like we're seeing the body bags on the TV from Vietnam, like we saw when I was growing up. So I spend my time and focus now, using my skill in military speak, talking to regular people who are patriotic, but can be persuaded to misuse their love for their country for their willingness to sacrifice for the war machine. Those are the people that I'm familiar with, from whom I come, and who I direct a lot of my conversation to. I think people who have a radical, progressive analysis, we're going to be all right, because we know what's going on. Not meaning that we're going to all survive, because we're the first ones to get assassinated. I'm just saying, we're at least we are not confused about the nature of the challenge and the struggle, where the people I really care about are the ones caught up in the churn, and they don't even know what's going on. They're just trying to do the right thing, live their lives as best they can, serve their country and their people and their community as best they can, and yet can be manipulated into working against not only the country's interests and the world's interests, but against their own interests with this war machine that we have. And those are the ones I want to talk to. And I can talk to them with the lived experience of having seen the body bags as a child. I mean, I'm not talking about on TV. I'm talking about at Brooke General Hospital, where I was, working as a candy striper. My passion right now is talking to the regular people who put up American flags on their yards because they think that's the right thing to do. And even though I wince every time I see one, I know it's a time. These are the very people that I have to prioritize as a way to build power, to challenge the routine nature of America as the greatest human rights violator in the world.
Well, thank you for that, Loretta. And thank you all for your generosity tonight and the openness of your spirits. And we hope that this conversation will inspire other conversations, and that people will take the energy and joy from tonight and the thoughtfulness that we shared and use this in their own communities to have these kinds of conversations and to begin to live in very, very different ways. As Dr. King said, we need to shift from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. And I think tonight we're all talking about where that shift is happening and how we can all contribute to it. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at our next conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Peace.
Yeah.
Myrna.
Yes, I'm here. I'm just so thankful to all of the panelists for the inspiration, for the energy, and for the recognition of, in order to have enough power, we must stand together. And I leave my little section here applauding the women who were with us tonight with just this little phrase, el pueblo unido jamás será vencido. Frank?
Yes, thank you, Myrna. Wow, you know, I want to quote Loretta, something she said in the panel. There is a freshness that I feel. This is a vibrant conversation we have had tonight,
Yes.
and we are going to continue that vibrant conversation on June 14th, discussing decolonization and colonialism, which came up repeatedly in the chat. And we invite all of you to stay with us through this journey, to join us on our next program, again on June 14th, to visit the website routinely and regularly. And we have built some beloved community here tonight, I think, and it's an inspiration to the work going forward. And with that, I want to invite Reverend Dorsey Blake, another member of the National Council of Elders, to give us our closing thoughts. Thank you all for being here and for participating.
Great Spirit, all-pervading presence, imminent mystery. Our hearts hunger for a connection and to be held in tenderness. For much bruises our spirits. Frightened we are by the madness of the violence we see and experience. Pernicious and devastating it is. On the brink of nuclear war, we build greater, more potent, more stealth, and deadly weapons of mass destruction. Diplomacy seems unheard of as a way to avoid nuclear catastrophe and annihilation, and acknowledging each other, each nation, as part of our cosmic network with all the magic and majesty of being alive. Violence stalks the land and even sees underground through waking and sleeping hours. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world, Prophet Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., called our nation, called us, the citizens, voters. Yet we must learn to live together as neighbors or die together as fools. An assignment is to put an end to war before war puts an end to us, our beautiful blue-green planet, and all of creation. We are grateful to our speakers who, while piercing through the oppression and our complicity, powerfully and passionately depicting our perilous times, also inspire us to reimagine our world, to reestablish the consciousness that people united have far more power than all the principalities and powers arrayed against us, the keepers of the old existing order. We have been in precarious places and times before. We have come over ways that with tears have been watered, treading a path through the blood of so many that have been slaughtered. Thankfully, we have seen the lotus flower rise from the mud, the pearl from irritation within the oyster, and our own lives stayed on freedom in the midst of oppression. And we resolve through our own personal, precious, and communal living that a culture of peace based in justice, nonviolence, compassion, and love will arise from the seemingly impenetrable culture of violence. To this, we pledge ourselves. Yes, Langston Hughes and Vincent Harding, we hear you indicting us to create this nation that is not yet, but can and must be. Oh, cosmic companion and accomplice, may we not shrink from our responsibility, for we already have enough experience, strength enough, vision enough to accomplish what is before us. Grant us the courage to transform the jangling chords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of community, animating songs of human and universal freedom, embedding hope in our new day dawning. Amen.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway.